It happened every year, and here it was again, that hated and much dreaded time of year, Christmas. And Miriam was mad, again. She was the only one in her class who didn't celebrate Christmas, the only one who didn't have a beautiful Christmas tree, the only one who wouldn't be hanging a stocking on Christmas Eve. It didn't matter that her family celebrated Hanukkah. Miriam knew that Hanukkah was only a very minor festival, the most minor and unimportant of the whole Jewish year, as a matter of fact. The truth was, as Miriam was fond of saying, in a manner far more advanced than her years, the truth was that the only reason anyone noticed that Hanukkah even existed was because it just happened to occur around Christmas time. And it didn't matter that Miriam's family celebrated other, more important holidays, like Passover and Rosh Hashanah, because those came at funny times of the year when no one else was paying much attention to holidays, and they largely passed unnoticed outside of her family. And so, when Miriam got in this mood, she started to dislike anything Jewish at all, including her own name, Miriam. It just sort of sat there. It fell off your tongue, plop, and just kind of lay there, a thick, heavy name. Not like her best friend, Melissa, whose name just rolled right off of your tongue like a song. Not like her friend, Ellie, a light, soft name that just floated from your mouth and into the air like a cloud. No, she was stuck with Miriam. Flat, dull, black. And then there was her hair. It was dark and thick and frizzed just about everywhere like a cartoon character who put a finger in the electric outlet and vzzt. It wasn't sleek and shiny like Melissa's or blonde and bouncy like Ellie's. It was a lump, a mess. "I hate Hanukkah," she cried out the first night as they were playing dreidel and watching the candles burn down. "Hanukkah is so boring," she cried out the second night, fingering the watercolors she had begged for all month, but which now seemed so incredibly boring. "I wish we could have a tree," she complained the third night. "Why do we have to be Jewish?" she finally cried in frustration on the fourth night, picking at her crisp latkes and sweet, smooth applesauce. On the fifth night, Miriam sulked alone upstairs in her room, and on the sixth night, she went over to Melissa's house and helped her family decorate the tree. On the seventh night, she sat in the dark at the top of the stairs and watched the burning Hanukkah candles quietly and alone where no one could see her. And then she announced, "I don't want to go to school for the rest of the week." "Oh," her mother asked, "isn't this the last week before vacation? Isn't your class having a big holiday party on Friday?" "It's not really a holiday party, you know that. Hanukkah will be over by then anyway," Miriam whined. "The teacher just calls it that on my account. It's really a Christmas party. Everyone knows that, and I don't want to go to any stupid Christmas party." "But I thought you liked Christmas things," her father asked. Miriam sulked. "Okay," her mother said, "if you don't want to go to school tomorrow, you don't have to. I could use a little break myself. I can work at home and spend some time with you too." Miriam was suddenly not at all sure she really wanted to miss all the festivities after all. Oh, it was all so confusing. She went to bed in a bad mood, hugging her teddy bear and crying herself to sleep. The next day, Miriam got to sleep in late. She and her mother shared a weekend-like breakfast of cinnamon toast made with challah, of course, warm maple syrup, and hot mint tea. After breakfast, Miriam's mother pulled out a big, tattered photo album. "I was a lot like you when I was your age," her mother began. "I also hated being the only Jewish girl in my class, and I wished every year for a Christmas tree. So why don't we have one?" Her mother opened the photo album and pointed to a large picture of a smiling woman with frizzy dark hair just like Miriam's. "This is why. My grandmother Sadie, my mother's mother, your great-grandmother. Just then, the phone rang, and Miriam's mother went into the kitchen to answer it. When she came back, she looked pale and scared, and she was talking very fast. Ruthie has fallen in the gym. They're sending her to the hospital. I'll call your father and go right away. I called Miss Callahan, and she'll come right over and stay with you. We'll call you from the hospital. Be a good girl now. Later, after her parents had phoned from the hospital to say Ruthie was getting stitches, and while Miss Callahan was cleaning up from lunch, Miriam wandered into the living room and picked up that old photo album. She looked at all those faces from the past, all those faces that looked just like her, all those faces that were long gone, and she remembered her mother's story about how her grandmother, Miriam's great-grandmother Sadie, had been smuggled out of Poland to safety. She stared at the picture of great-grandmother Sadie, that face that looked so much like her own, and then, not even knowing why, Miriam whispered to the photograph, "I wish I could have known you, great-grandma Sadie." "And I wish I could have known you too, Bubala," a soft voice with a thick Polish accent whispered back. Miriam looked up startled. No one was there, but she had heard a voice, hadn't she? "So, why don't we get to know each other now?" the voice said, and Miriam jumped. This time, she could see a shape across the room, in the dark, shadowy corner. When it started to move, Miriam's heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it would burst right out of her chest. She was just about to call for Miss Callahan when the shape reached the light, and she immediately recognized it was no other than her great-grandmother, Sadie. How did you get here?" Miriam stammered. "You called for me." Great-grandmother Sadie smiled as she stroked Miriam's hair. "Shana Mado, such a lovely girl," she whispered. Miriam looked down at the photograph on her lap, then up to the gentlewoman sitting next to her. Yes, it was her. Impossible as it was, great-grandmother Sadie was sitting here, right next to her. When Miriam looked at Sadie's frizzy hair, gently framing her soft face, she noticed that the way it caught the light, it looked like a halo around her head. Suddenly, frizzy hair looked beautiful. "So, my little one, you think that Hanukkah is boring? It's just that, well, all my friends have Christmas trees all decorated and lit up, and a big feast and special songs and so many presents." "When I was a child," my great-grandmother Sadie began, "Hanukkah was such a beautiful time of year. The whole house was lit up with candlelight because there were 8 of us, and we each had our own menorah to light. We sang happy, silly songs and played silly dreidel games, and more seriously, we would also remember that we were celebrating our survival as people. Papa would give us each our gold coins, and I always bought sweets with mine. My mouth would water with smells of the crisp latkes sizzling in the hot oil, and I could hardly wait to eat." Somehow, the way great-grandma Sadie described it, it didn't sound boring at all. In fact, it sounded quite exciting. "So, we may not have anything to compare to Christmas, but who has anything to compare with our feast of Passover, our celebration of freedom, with our songs and our stories that we tell and retell every year until we know them by heart, and then we tell them again? And you, my little one, it is extra special for you because we tell the story of Miriam, who, by bravely and proudly saving her brother Moses, saved all the Jews, and who has anything to compare with the sweetness and light challah bread and the apples dipped in honey for Rosh Hashanah, and for the sweetness of the new year. And no one has anything to compare to Sukkos, celebrating the harvest and building the sukkah." Miriam thought about her own sukkah. Last fall, the 3-walled hut in the backyard with cornstalk roof in which they ate all their meals for a week, and where Miriam even slept for 3 whole nights, watching the stars between the open spaces in the thatched roof as she drifted off to sleep. Yes, their sukkah was quite special. All her friends had been quite envious, in fact. And now, listening to great-grandma Sadie describe each of the ceremonies and holidays with joy and enthusiasm, Miriam realized how beautiful and unique each one really was. "It's hard to be different, and it can be very lonely," Sadie whispered. "And you are wanting presents, aren't you? Well, let me show you your greatest gift of all." Suddenly, in front of them stood a long line of women who looked like Miriam and Sadie, their arms interlocked like a long chain stretching as far as she could see, across the room, out the door, and down the street. Great-grandmother Sadie took the arm of the woman nearest her and clasped her other arm around Miriam so that she too was now a part of that long, fantastic chain. Dozens of grandmothers, hundreds of grandmothers, and Miriam somehow knew that they were all her grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers, great-great-great-grandmothers, great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers, and each one held her lighted menorah and sang the Hanukkah prayer, and the room was flooded with dazzling light. Suddenly, someone tried to pull them apart, to break their chain, but the grandmothers held tight. More people came and tried to destroy this chain, which led from the beginning of all time right here to where Miriam stood in her living room. But the grandmothers held tight. Miriam shuddered at the man with a swastika on his arm as he came towards great-grandmother Sadie, and she held on tightly to her. The chain of grandmothers bent and twisted here and there, but nowhere did it break or snap. And Miriam realized that if it had been broken anywhere, this chain of grandmothers that led to her, that she herself could not be here today, and that the gift of her great-grandmother Sadie was showing her was indeed the greatest gift of all. It was the gift of life. And as soon as Miriam realized this, it all disappeared. And then great-grandmother Sadie was there alone with her. Sadie smiled broadly and nodded her head in approval, and then without another word, she too disappeared. It was late when Miriam's mother and father finally got home with Ruthie, who proudly showed off the bandage above her right eye, feeling very important as she bragged, 6 stitches! A half more inch and I would have lost my eye, the doctor said. They ate a quick light supper, and then their father said, "Time for bed, you two." Halfway up the stairs, Miriam turned and ran back down. "We didn't light the menorah tonight," she cried out. Miriam's parents looked at each other in surprise. "You're absolutely right," her father said, and he smiled as he began to set up the candles. Someday, Miriam would tell them about great-grandmother Sadie's visit. Someday she would tell them how much she suddenly loved all her frizzy curls that were just like great-grandma Sadie's. Someday she would tell them how glad she was to have such a strong, brave name as Miriam. Someday she would tell them of her unspoken promise to great-grandmother Sadie to try her very best in whatever ways she could to always keep the chain unbroken. For now, though, it was her own special secret, her own special gift, and as she watched the candles burn down, she was sure she could feel great-grandma Sadie standing there, right beside her, holding her hand, and Miriam knew in her heart that she could always carry her great-grandmother Sadie's precious gift with her, the gift of love, the gift of life, the gift of light.